In the wake of the 3 Mile Island nuclear catastrophe, Norman co-authored Killing Our Own, The Disaster of America's Experience with Atomic Radiation, with Rolling Stone correspondent Harvey Wasserman. He has since co-authored 7 books, including Target Iraq, What the News Media Didn't Tell You, with foreign correspondent Reese Ehrlich. Since this book's release in 2003, it has been published in Germany, Italy, Hungary, Brazil, and South Korea. His other books include Unreliable Sources with Martin Lee, Through the Media Looking Glass with FAIR founder Jeff Cohen, and The Habits of Highly Deceptive Media, which won the George Orwell Award for distinguished contribution to honesty and clarity in public language, presented by the National Council of Teachers of English. Norman's latest book, War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death, was published in June of 2005, and it quickly went into a second printing 2 months later in August. Paperback edition will appear next month. Perhaps what makes War Made Easy so important is that it provides a straightforward historical and institutional context for disassembling the myths surrounding U.S. foreign policy and for understanding the media's central role in convincing the population of the world's sole superpower, us, in the United States, to support or accept America's illegal and immoral wars, from the Gulf of Tonkin to the 2003 invasion and continuing occupation of Iraq. Please extend a warm UDC welcome to Norman Solomon.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Yeah, it was about 5 years ago, and I've thought of this very often since then, at the first World Social Forum. Eduardo Galeano spoke of walking down the streets of a Latin American city, and on a wall he saw in big letters somebody had written, "Let's save pessimism for better times." You know, in retrospect, and who could predict, in Latin America, pessimism would have turned out to be very unwarranted. In deference to the importance of optimism and hope, I won't talk about the other continents right off. But really the question that I sometimes do dread that comes up is, well, are you optimistic? And I say, well, I'm not optimistic or fatalistic. I'm hopeful with some caveats, and it all depends on what people do. Of all the things that we have in front of us, the most deadly is passivity. The most deadly is going with the program, or as Galeano says, in some way accepting the idea that the future is another word for the present and the past. When I heard what Deborah had to say this morning, Deborah James, as always in print and in speaking, she very incisively talked about the key crossroads that at this moment humanity faces in so many different contexts, economic, political, geopolitical, in what kind of society we want to have. And when she was speaking about coverage of Venezuela in the US media, I remembered something that Aldous Huxley had written in an introduction to Brave New World. He said, lies are powerful, but even more powerful is silence about truth. And it is the omissions, the information of various types, not only the statistics, but the human dimensions. The omission of information is really the most powerful way in which the anesthetic of distortion and passivity is administered. I won't say every day, I would say every minute now, because there is no deadline anymore in US news media. The 24-hour cycle is now a nanosecond cycle, as we can see as we learn the latest about Michael Jackson and Jolo and everybody else on cable. Often I've lately thought of the metaphor of the body politic, that for democracy to function in a meaningful way, there has to be a free flow of information and ideas, a circulation of analysis, debate, facts, contention, different views of the world simultaneously competing or at least contesting in the public arena. And we have in the United States, despite all the rhetoric that we get, systemic blockage of the body politic. And we know what happens physiologically when there's blockage in a circulatory system. But chronically in the US society, we've had these sort of blockages, the concentrations of capital, of power, of capacity to pass along information, to have debates, blocked and blocked and blocked. And we've seen the results again and again manifested, including, not only, but including in terms of war, the country being dragged into one war after another. And it was only after War Made Easy came out that I realized of all the different meanings that the phrase had for me and that I was trying to include in the title, there was one I hadn't thought of when it came off the press, and that was also class war. That war from the top down on the basis of class is also made easy so many ways through the punditocracy, through the ways in which government officials function and don't function, through the routine ways in which some reporting goes on and other reporting does not. The most powerful propaganda being what blends in with the scenery. You know, it's a truism. You know, Deborah and I and Jim and people here in general, we have a bias. We have a political agenda. Unlike Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, because they blend in with the scenery, which is the definition of balance. That they're part of the prevailing power structure and the wallpaper that is put up in the echo chambers of the news media. There are assumptions. I mean, if Adam Smith came back, he would be considered by the Wall Street editorial page to be a Marxist. Because he didn't really believe that wealth creates all labor. He had it backwards in terms of the tacit and sometimes explicit orthodoxy of the US news media projected out onto the world. And so routinely on so-called public radio, on NPR, on PRI, we get the business reports, we get the hourly updates on every tick of the Dow and the FTSE and on, and we don't have, you know, let alone a daily or an hourly, a weekly labor program. You pick up the Sun Sentinel or the New York Times or any other daily paper in the country, large, small, they all have a business section, not one has a labor section. Why? Because the assumption, you know, there are only 100+ million people in the country working or trying to work for a living every day. How could that compete in terms of importance to the trials and tribulations of the CEOs and the investors and so forth? And so that becomes normalized. That's routine, that's objective, and that is professional. If you went into a newsroom as an employee tomorrow and you said, hey, what gives? I picked up the paper this morning. There's a business section again. There's no labor section. Or go into All Things Considered, a morning edition, and say, you know, I'm thinking about our on the half-hour newscasts, and there's a business update. Where's the labor update? Where's the report on what is the wait times now average across the country in emergency rooms for people without medical coverage? What is the on-the-job injury rate that is preventable, released by the Department of Labor? Let's give an update, not just every fluctuation of the stock markets. Well, obviously, that's not considered in the realm of responsible journalism, which says something about the realm of responsible journalism as it's defined. When we look and try to put in perspective the flow of the last 5, 10, 20 years, the historic continuity is striking, but also how more extreme the militarism of our political culture is, the political economy, the media. I was thinking that my first attendance to a UDC conference was in 1991, just after the Gulf War, and who would have thought there would be so many wars in the next 10 or 15 years. There is a continuity, but there's an extreme direction that the policymakers have moved in, and I think we're at a situation where quantity does beget a qualitative difference in the kind of policies we have, the way in which the policies are administered, the effects on people, and the dangers involved. You know, people say, well, what difference would it make to wrest away from the Republican Party the control of the Congress or the White House? And in many ways, we know it would make very little difference. And yet, it's necessary, but not obviously not sufficient, to first dislodge the extreme right wing from state power. It's impossible to imagine that we get the kind of progressive change or momentum we want as long as they remain in power, even though if they're ejected, we may not get very far. I've really been struck by how in the last 50 years, which is the period I've lived through, not coincidentally, but that I've also tried to study in recent years historically, the way in which militarism, the way in which class war has been absolutely central to the basic political and media power structure of the country. And the omission process includes putting down in the deep Orwellian hole statements by mainstream leaders. Dwight Eisenhower, when he talked about the military-industrial complex, that phrase is rarely mentioned in the U.S. news media, and even more rarely mentioned in a serious way, if it is recalled as kind of as a toss-off phrase. Even less, really, is discussion of Eisenhower's cross of iron speech. And today we could say, and this could be a powerful sort of grounded message having to do with the economy, having to do with people's lives, echoing what Eisenhower said several decades ago, that every tank, every battleship, every bomber, every bullet is in a real sense a theft from the children of the world. That's a powerful, real, human-based analysis and message rarely heard in the news media of this country. If you, for instance, watch Washington Week in Review on PBS on Friday night, and if you can stay through the whole half hour and be awake at the end of it, you'll notice that there's a lot of commercial plugs at the beginning and end. So you have the first of this year, a company with, you might say, a passing interest in decision-making in Washington, the Boeing Corporation, has signed on as I can't say an advertiser. They are able to purchase enhanced underwriter credits. They're not commercials. And you'll notice the difference on PBS. You know you're not watching a commercial when it's Mozart and when they're Volvos, and it's very, kind of erudite sounding in terms of ambience. Well, I call and I talk to people who do the PR for Washington Week in Review, and it used to be called White Washington Week in Review informally, but they've made some cosmetic changes. And they said, well, of course this doesn't influence us, which is the standard matter here in terms of the message from the PR department. But you watch the show and you realize the way in which certain topics are simply, and again this goes to the propaganda function of omission, absolutely off the table. Somebody quotes Eisenhower along the lines that I've just discussed, not really something that would enhance the possibilities of Boeing renewing. These are obviously topics that have been redefined as highly controversial and even worse, not worth exploring because they're not part of the political agenda of the country, which is to say certain agendas. The way in which terms are redefined, are you for globalization or against it? Well, there are many, many people around the world. They're in favor of globalization for human rights, for sharing of cultures, for solidarity and labor rights, for protection of the environment. But then, of course, it's the corporate globalization that gets a very different response from the elites and from the grassroots. I was recently in Greece just a couple of weeks ago, and I was asked at a forum, what has happened to the American dream? And that kind of stopped me for a moment, since it's capital A, capital D. And my response, the best I could come up with, is, well, I think for several hundred years there have been basically two American dreams. One has been for social justice, and the other has been to get as rich as possible. And those are competing visions, and the news media have promoted, I think, increasingly one more than the other, even though it was never a pretty picture in terms of the values being promoted by mass media. When I've tried to understand patterns of media manipulation in terms of war in the U.S., TV, radio, newspapers, and the like, I've come to think of it could be broken down into dozens or hundreds of layers, I suppose, but I've come to think of three layers in particular. One is factual information, just empirical info where key facts are omitted or rarely mentioned, often what could be called public secrets. They're not never mentioned, they're just, maybe the very back of a New York Times article, which is where most of their important information is, if it gets in at all. And then also the insertion of lies, deceptions, and distortion. So that's a factual layer. Then there's one of analysis. What does it mean? How can it and will it and is it being spun? And then there's the human realities, and often the numbing, the anesthetics when it comes to war, simply what has to do with people's lives and their suffering and their death. And that layer too, subjected to enormous amounts of media manipulation, including, of course, a lot of simply omission. So the reliance on official sources at all of these different layers, of course, is pivotal. The stenographic function of news media for the powerful, how objectivity is defined. Of course, if you choose your sources, you choose your perspective. That's the way that bias is put forward. It used to be, we hear journalists say how good it is now, the professionalism of the news media, and it's true there have been some changes. 100 years ago on the front page of the major U.S. media outlets, it might say, country X is a grave threat to the American way of life. And now, because the standards of journalism have improved so much, the lead might be the leaders of country X are a threat to the American way of life, senior administration officials said yesterday. And then we know we're okay. It's when you come down to cases, and whether it's coverage of particular countries or dynamics or U.S. policy, that the really grotesque and the sometimes overused Orwellian term really does become applicable and comes into play. And when we talk about, for instance, the NSA, it took, even though I worked on the story, it took many days after the NSA scandal broke last December through the New York Times for me to realize just the roots of the NSA involvement in spying and war preparation in the last few years vis-a-vis the United Nations. It's a characteristic of the praise for U.S. news media that you flip over that rock and you find something that does not look good at all in terms of the realities of the circulation of information through the body politic idea. Yes, the good news is last December, the New York Times broke the story about NSA eavesdropping on telephone conversations with one of the parties being in the United States. Yeah, that's the good news. The bad news is they sat on the story for more than a year. They waited. They had the essential story before November 2004. And part of the explanation for why they held the story is that when they first got it, these are by they, meaning the very top of the New York Times, the ownership, the top management, Bill Keller and so forth, it was too close to the presidential election of the United States. So they didn't want to seem to be trying to influence the election, and they needed to hold it. So, journalism should hold back from actually doing its job when it would really matter the most. As Napoleon said, it's not necessary to censor the news, it's sufficient to delay it until it no longer matters. And we could say, well, history always matters, but it certainly matters a lot more in real time. When the U.S. was in its final stages of so-called diplomacy before the invasion of Iraq, it was engaged in this time-honored process, which we are now in the midst of, Washington is in the midst of, in terms of preparing for, I think, what will be a air attack on Iran. The pundits and the Washington elites, the policymakers, were involved in this ritual of what you could call laying the flagstones on the path to war. And part of that is, to mix metaphors, using diplomacy as kind of a launch pad for the war. Because it matters what people think, we live in a society with elements of democracy, so therefore getting the population to feel, if not overwhelmingly supportive of the war, at least to not generate enough opposition that it would cause a real problem, it's necessary to accentuate the idea that diplomacy is underway. And you have this ritual of the Secretary of State and other officials, they go to New York, to the UN, they shuttle to foreign capitals, they say, how they're really hopeful that this problem can be resolved through diplomacy. And it's, as Bertolt Brecht said, when the leaders speak of peace, prepare for war. When they speak about how much they really care about diplomacy, then you've got a very serious militaristic problem on it. One of the horsemen is galloping along towards at least a little bit of an apocalypse for some people. So you flash back to early of 2003. And then in March, the first Sunday in March, the Observer newspaper in Britain broke the story that the middle six delegations, the six swing vote delegations, rotating members of the UN Security Council, had been targeted for what the NSA, the US NSA, called a spying surge. They use the word surge. Wiretapping of telephones, home and office in New York of these diplomats, checking their email, violations of all kinds of protocols and conventions the U.S. is signatory to. But they were trying to get the goods on and understand what the possibilities were to get a war resolution through the Security Council. They'd gotten to kind of a half-baked measure through. Tony Blair wanted one that was really a war resolution. Bush kind of wanted one. They never did get one. But the NSA was being used as an instrument to try to push one through. And so the story broke in the Observer, and then it was a huge story in much of the world. In countries such as Chile that have had some experience, shall we say, with US intervention and spying and manipulation, an outcry. Many countries, an outcry. In the United States, and I chronicle this in the War Made Easy book, very little coverage, very transitory coverage, and in the newspaper of record, no coverage at all. And a couple of days after it broke in the Observer, I called up Daniel Ellsberg to get his comment. He said, this is potentially more important than the Pentagon Papers, because this is a story that has broken before the war has begun. And just about 72 hours later, when it still had not been reported in the New York Times, I called their foreign desk, talked to an editor there, Alison Smalley, and I said, why are we not seeing this in the New York Times? And she said, well, we like to do our own intelligence reporting. And then she added that their sources at the CIA had been unable to confirm this memo, which was interesting, veto power there. The LA Times, being a little bit less inside the Beltway, did report it. It was about a 500-word story. And along with saying that everybody does it, which is what the Washington Post reported, that spying at the UN is routine, the LA Times story also strongly intimated and implied that it was a bogus counterfeit document. This was not really an NSA memo about the spying on the middle six at the UN. Well, days later, a woman who it later emerged was Catherine Gunn, a 29-year-old intelligence agency employee in England, was arrested for leaking a document. And of course, although her name wasn't released for months, the fact of her arrest was in the US, was rather in the British media. Ordinarily, people aren't arrested for leaking counterfeit or bogus documents. So it was ipso facto confirmation that it was real. And yet, the New York Times just didn't want to cover it at all. The media history of collusion, participation in, being part of what we could call the warfare state is sordid and ugly. It's not new. I was really unhappy to see statements like Howard Dean in his 2004 presidential campaign. He had his campaign nationally put out a statement that for the first time in U.S. history, the President of the United States had launched a war on a country without exhausting all avenues for peace. I mean, what planet is he living on? And is this some kind of, surrealistic, strange, through the glass darkly version of what we're supposed to believe history is? And does stating it as history then kind of in the Washington idea that perception is reality, kind of make it reality? Well, maybe he's making hay that this president is so extreme. But I think that kind of, whether what do we call ourselves or others call us, scholars, educators, students, researchers, activists, just putting up bogus history because it's useful perhaps at the moment will come back and bite you sooner or later. If the baseline of U.S. military intervention is assumed to be appropriate, and we have this glitch called the Bush administration, then watch out. I went back and especially after CNN felt compelled to retract a story they did a number of years ago on use of gas in Laos, and it caused an uproar. It was fairly well documented, actually, but some real heat came down from officials with a long track record of veracity who demanded a retraction, including Henry Kissinger. And CNN dutifully retracted. And I thought, well, gee, this was the late 90s. And I thought, gee, you know, the Gulf of Tonkin reporting was known now to be totally deceptive and fallacious. So I wonder if the New York Times and Washington Post have ever retracted their coverage. And, you know, I'd gone to the microfilm, and this is, you know, of course, it's not on Nexus or electronic databases, and you see these kind of blurry front page stories, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, all in early August 1964, reporting as absolute facts, absolute lies. And I called the Times, couldn't get any sort of answer. I called the Washington Post and eventually was referred to Murray Marder, who I could see on the microfilm had written the front page diplomatic coverage of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. And I reached him at home, retired, and I asked him if there had ever been a retraction. He said, no, I can assure you, Mr. Solomon, there's never been a retraction of the Post coverage of the Gulf of Tonkin. And I asked, well, why not? And he paused and he said, well, if the news media were going to retract their coverage of the Gulf of Tonkin events, then they'd need to retract their coverage of just about the entire Vietnam War. Now, he wasn't trying to be funny. It's not exactly a perspective, shall we say, that gets a lot of discussion in the U.S. news media. One of the things I've tried to look at is some of the wars that haven't gotten much attention. And I should say my War Made Easy book got almost no mass media reviews. The exception, really, was the Los Angeles Times, which gave it a fairly positive review, actually. The one caveat was that the first chapter, the reviewer said, had kind of labored on an obscure event, the invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965. Well, actually, that's why I wanted to lead off with that, because it has been obscured, and also because certainly it wasn't obscure to the 3,000 people who had been living in the Dominican Republic who are estimated to have lost their lives, or the few dozen U.S. soldiers who died, or their loved ones. And you have these kind of patterns which are so boilerplate, and just the evidentiary record, the history, what has come out of the archives and through FOIA and been released, is devastating. A few years ago, the phone conversations having to do with the invasion of the Dominican Republic involving President Johnson were released, and the tapes are available and the transcripts are available. And they show how President Johnson basically made stuff up and then had his, does this sound familiar, favorite exile, Mr. Balagar, who's kind of like a precursor to Ahmed Chalabi. You know, he was in New York, so obviously he knew very well what was going on in the Dominican Republic, and that qualified him as somebody who was an advisor to the U.S. government for the invasion of the Dominican Republic, to then come back and be installed as president. And you go forward several decades and you see just the decimation and devastation of the economy, which endures. That was a victory. That was the real U.S. victory, is that in the 21st century now, you still have this horrible poverty and enormous inequity economically in the Dominican Republic because the president saying that U.S. citizens' lives were in danger, and then within days saying with equal falsehood that the communists were involved, quote unquote, in trying to restore democracy in the Dominican Republic. You had this dynamic going on where the threat of democracy was repelled and essentially oligarchy was restored. And you just run through the list. Okay, Grenada and Panama in the 1980s and that invasion. And you know, I was thinking about the term strongman. Now Hugo Chavez strongman. Well, it got so that Manuel Noriega, his first name was strongman Manuel Noriega, but only after he had a falling out with the CIA, or was it vice versa, and all of a sudden the good man became the strongman. He wouldn't cooperate with the Contra war, and so his drug dealing, which was known for a very long time, suddenly became an issue. The wars in Central America. I found this tremendous set of parallels where we've had a lot of Hitlers around in U.S. foreign policy. And if you go back to the mid-1980s, then Secretary of State George Shultz went on a public stump in front of a podium and said in the mid-1980s that a friend of his had just returned from Sandinista-ruled Nicaragua, and it reminded his friend of the Third Reich. So if you can go there in terms of Hitler analogies, you can go pretty much anywhere. And we've had a lot of different Hitlers over the years in the U.S. news media. Ho Chi Minh, there were a lot of invocations to the idea of you can't have another Munich, the man with the umbrella and Chamberlain. And this time, we're not going to engage in appeasement. And so that was a lot of, the underpinning of the media rationale for continuing the Vietnam War. Well, then you just walk through the Hitlers we've had since then, including Noriega, who we were told when he was arrested, one of his offices had a picture of Hitler on the wall. It also had a picture of Moshe Dayan, but they didn't go into that. And you also had, of course, Slobodan Milosevic. He was a Hitler. You had Saddam Hussein, who became a Hitler a few years after, in December 1983, Donald Rumsfeld, representing the Reagan administration, went to Baghdad, and there's the famous photo, although it's not in the U.S. news media much, of the handshake deal where they were going to increase agricultural credits and precursor chemicals for chemical weapons and all sorts of aid to Saddam Hussein's regime. And Saddam Hussein was a Hitler, but not then. A few years later, when he crossed the U.S. government, the New Republic magazine published a story in the late 1980s, and they said in the article, point blank, that the United States had to give more aid to Saddam Hussein's regime. That it wasn't enough. Yes, the U.S. was tilting towards Iraq in terms of its war with Iran and giving a lot of aid and political support to Saddam Hussein's regime. But the article said that it wasn't enough. And then a couple of years later, when the invasion of Kuwait happened by Iraqi forces, the same magazine, the New Republic, published a full cover picture of Saddam Hussein's face, and the magazine digitally adjusted his mustache so it would look much more like Hitler's mustache. So that gives us an idea of the way the ebb and flow goes on. The question of does history matter is one that the U.S. news media, I think, dodge constantly. And it's a possibility that we have to simply bring up history. I mean, I think more and more progressives are understood by many journalists and historians to be fighting for history to be preserved or exhumed. Whether it's the Donald Rumsfeld photograph and all that it implies, whether it has to do with all kinds of double standards on human rights that have been in play and continue to be in play in terms of news media and U.S. foreign policy. It was Philip Graham who resuscitated the Washington Post in the 1930s and 40s as the owner, who said that journalism is a first draft of history, which is kind of scary, especially since it's understood in the long run to be the last draft of history. When you look at the quality of it, then we are often in kind of Orwellian land. I think one of the key aspects in terms of setting the stage for war is the double standard on human rights. If it would be possible in the U.S. news media and public discourse to establish a single standard of human rights, it would fundamentally change the terrain through which the powers that be drag this country into war time after time. Just a couple of quick examples. You may have heard once or twice or a few hundred times that Saddam Hussein gassed his own people about his crimes against the Kurds. And of course, you go across the border into Turkey, and the Turkish government in the 1990s committed horrible crimes, by any definition, extreme ethnic cleansing, destroying thousands of villages, torturing, making speaking of the Kurdish language illegal, something that made what Slobodan Milosevic did seem, while certainly horrible, comparatively mild in terms of magnitude at least. And yet, through the news media, even while the agenda building went on for the invasion of Iraq, no mention, even then, of what Turkey had been doing to the Kurds. And when I and others would bring this up, and radio talk shows and so forth, the common response is, that's ancient history. Why are you talking about the late 1990s, or even before that, And yet these are the same sources that continue to say, well, Saddam Hussein, he gassed his own people. What are you trying to ignore? What he did in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, and yet, of course, this was concurrent with a lot of U.S. aid in the process. I want to talk about a war that the liberal, quote, liberal media, and people who were self-described as liberals, or even on the left, loved to love, and that was the war on Yugoslavia. For 78 straight days, the U.S.-led NATO forces bombed Kosovo, Yugoslavia, and at the end, the Pentagon proudly announced that not a single U.S. life had been lost throughout that entire 78 days. The argument was that we needed to stand against this Hitlerian force in Europe, that ethnic cleansing could not be tolerated. And yet if you go and you do reach into that Orwellian vacuum tube, you find August 1995, at least 150,000 Serbs were forcibly driven out of the Krajina region. Franjo Tuđman, essentially a fascist, announced and launched what he called Operation Storm. And there's good branding that is learned from the U.S. government. Desert Storm, 1991, 1995, Operation Storm, kind of like a force of nature, right? And Misha Glenny, the BBC correspondent, said Serbs were being shot like rabbits. And Carl Bildt, the former Swedish prime minister, and then at this point an EU negotiator, this is what he said. He said, this is contemporaneous to the ethnic cleansing. If we accept that it is all right for Tuđman to cleanse Croatia of its Serbs, then how on earth can we object if Yeltsin cleanses Chechnya, or if one day Milosevic sends his army to clean out the Albanians from Kosovo? This is the middle of 1995. Then Misha, and the media image is often, well, the president, he's busy, or he has other priorities, or he didn't take action quickly enough. And so one might assume that that was the case, but it was not the case. As Misha Glenny reported in his book, The Fall of Yugoslavia, quote, the entire offensive was undertaken by the authorities in Zagreb with the support of the United States government. President Clinton himself welcomed Operation Storm. So it's, Clinton was not in a good position to preach against ethnic cleansing, since he had supported it, any more than he was in a good position to get on the presidential bully pulpit when the tragedy happened at Columbine High School and talk about how violence is never a way to vent one's emotions or outlook, while even then some of the heaviest bombing of Yugoslavia was going on under orders of the president. Well, these are not contradictions that the news media are interested in this country in talking about, but they're contradictions that are really part of the linchpin of what progressives can do to expose the kind of political economy and media system that we live under. If we go back and look, for instance, at the New York Times front page the last Sunday of April 1999, it stated, and this is the lead of the news report, NATO began its second month of bombing against Yugoslavia yesterday with new strikes against military targets that disrupted civilian electrical and water supplies. I think that's just remarkable. You can bomb military targets that disrupt civilian electrical and water supplies, but it's just military bombing, even though it violates Geneva Conventions and other accords the U.S. is a signatory to. Obviously, hospitals, medical clinics, elderly, others who are vulnerable. They're going to have their electricity and water cut off. This is a crime. This is a war crime, and yet it's being reported in the New York Times as bombing military targets. Not to be left out of the equation, Thomas Friedman that month in his April 23rd column, 1999, wrote, quote, "It should be lights out in Belgrade. Every power grid, water pipe, bridge, road, and war-related factory has to be targeted," unquote. And really, when you read what Thomas Friedman, for instance, has written, and let's not pick on Fox News, for the moment. Judith Miller on the front page of the New York Times had more to do with dragging this country into the invasion of Iraq than Fox News could ever dream of. If you look at Thomas Friedman, the avowed liberal, praised, the world is flat and so forth. During the bombing of Yugoslavia, he went on television, he wrote columns, and he used the phrase, and he recycled it, and this is the kind of recycling I'm against. Again and again, he used the phrase, "Give war a chance. Give war a chance." And then, when the bombing of Afghanistan was underway, a couple of years later, he recycled again. He said, "Give war a chance." Well, how can we understand that? Well, I think one of the taboos in U.S. media coverage, or let's say commentary, is to look at the possibility that among many other factors, and I do political and media analysis, not psychoanalysis, but one of the factors that is an element here is there's a strong streak of sadism among policymakers and a lot of the pundits. And so what do you make of those kind of comments from Thomas Friedman? More analytically, perhaps, we can go to his 1999 book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, recently off the press, the same year as the bombing of Yugoslavia. This is what he wrote, Thomas Friedman. Quote, "The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of the U.S. Air Force F-15. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies to flourish is called the U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps." And we should give him credit for candor there. The war on terrorism, as it's called, is an outgrowth of a godsend for the right wing, the Bush administration. What happened on September 11, 2001 probably saved the Bush presidency if you look at the trajectory of the polls. And I think one of the huge challenges we have now is to really look at the media's and the political elites' functional use of the term terrorism. It's not easy, it's been walled off as a discussion. And yet, if we're going to have a single standard of human rights, we also need to have a single standard of terrorism. So, for instance, Colin Powell was in Latin America when 9/11 happened. And he very quickly issued a statement, and he said that we have to condemn those who destroy buildings and kill people for political purposes. And I think that, he's absolutely correct. And if you go back and you look at, say, what did he tell a New York Times reporter, and I quote exactly in the book, when the Gulf War was over, and he was asked, what's your assessment or view of these civilian casualties in Iraq as a result of the 6 weeks of the Gulf War? And Colin Powell said, well, that's not a number that concerns me very much. You have essentially state terrorism where the actions that are taken predictably will kill large numbers of civilians, and yet we're told that that's very different than any sort of thing under the category of terrorism, even though as it's experienced by people who have a cruise missile arrive in their neighborhood or whatever the military form of attack, they are being terrorized. They're being terrorized on the basis of deceptions that serve as political and media rationales for the attack to begin with. And then the lies are recycled, and the news media not only are belated, if ever, in challenging the lies, but wall off the kind of terroristic experiences at the other end of the U.S. missiles, the terror that's experienced from the lies, and making that connection. The president lies, people are terrorized. It's not simply an inevitable war or to use the terrible phrase collateral damage. It has to do with an entire system of the warfare state. When the U.S. troops were crossing the border into Iraq a few years ago, Tom Brokaw, who ostensibly worked for NBC, but of course he really worked for General Electric and as the owner of the network, and when the missiles were fired, his bosses were hearing the cash registers ring. He was not going to bite the hand that signed his paycheck. This is what he said on the air. He said, quote, "One of the things that we don't want to do is to destroy the infrastructure of Iraq because in a few days we're going to own that country," unquote. And so it does kind of, raise that question that has been brought up on a number of posters and at many demonstrations, what is our oil doing under their sand? The whole problem of aggressive war is one that we have to deal with. It's part of the warfare state of the United States. And talk about disappearing history. The Nuremberg tribunals, right after the end of World War II, had Robert Jackson as the representative of the United States saying that the worst crime was aggression against another state, that to plan and implement military aggression on another country was a supreme international crime. And yet, while we can understand why the U.S. government, top officials, do not want the U.S. government to be part of the International Criminal Court, it does beg the question, why is there virtually no mass media discussion in this country of whether George W. Bush is a war criminal? It certainly is debatable. It could be talked about in serious terms. Briefs could be filed. Op-ed pages could be filled. And when this comes up, I think of this, when the question comes up, people will sometimes say, well, I see a lot of diversity of opinion in the New York Times and the major media outlets, and you hear just all kinds of discussion. And I say, well, let's do a little measurement here. Go to Nexus and find the number of daily newspapers in the country that have published an op-ed piece in any way exploring the possibility that George W. Bush should be brought to trial on charges of being a war criminal. And when you total up that number, you'll get an index of the diversity of U.S. news media in terms of ideology and in terms of raising questions that would be difficult for the power structure. Well, I don't want to go on much longer, but I want to mention something that was very striking to me, and as the years have gone by, even more so. Chris Hedges wrote a book called War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning after working as a correspondent for ultimately the New York Times in war situations for a number of years, the Gulf War. Before that, he was stationed in Central America. And he recounts that in the 1960s, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who's almost a dead ringer for Donald Rumsfeld, he talked about how the U.S. government was bombing North Vietnam to send a message to the communist leaders in Hanoi. And Hedges recalls that during the 1980s, when he was a reporter based in San Salvador, one morning at the hotel where he and other reporters were staying, they woke up and they discovered that in front of the hotel, several corpses had been dumped. And inside the mouths of the corpses were written messages, warning messages, to the journalists inside. So, as Hedges points out, the death squads, which we know were aligned with the U.S.-supported government, the death squads were sending a message in that way to those reporters. And so, on September 11th, 2001, Osama bin Laden sent a message to leaders he didn't like. And then in bombing Afghanistan, George W. Bush sent a message to leaders who he didn't like. And we have a lot of message sending going on that are in a very lethal form. And then there's this kind of U.S. American exceptionalism. This notion, well, they should understand. We're sorry that some people got killed because of our actions. But they should understand we didn't mean it, unlike those other bad people, which of course doesn't go very far, that kind of exceptionalism. And yet it's really inherent, almost an automatic assumption in U.S. media coverage. And it's as though we're told, well, you know, if there was a crime committed, a bank robbery or murder or whatever, and then we're going down the streets of, say, West Palm Beach, and the police at noon hour are spraying the storefronts with machine gun fire because they think somewhere out there is a perpetrator of the crime. And you have all these people who have been shopping and who work in these stores, and they're killed. And then the explanation is, well, you know, we didn't mean to kill you. I don't think that would be acceptable in a civilized society. And yet that's exactly the kind of argument that we get from the media justifiers of U.S. foreign policy and war. That we didn't, unlike those bad people, we don't intend to do it. We know it's going to happen, but we didn't intend to do it, so therefore we're not culpable. We're not culpable at all. It's what can be called jingo narcissism. It's a kind of an exceptionalism that is chronic with one war after another. And there is also a worship of technology in media war coverage. It needs to be dealt with. You know, the idea that if you're a suicide bomber and you're very low tech and you strap to your body dynamite or explosives or whatever, that's reprehensible, that's inhuman, that's terrible and barbaric. But if you have helicopter gunships or satellite-guided missiles that go into urban neighborhoods and kill people, that's civilized. That is a way that bespeaks of high values. And I thought of something that Lenny Bruce used to talk about soon before he died in the mid-1960s. He recounted a poem by Thomas Merton that he liked to quote. He said, "You think you're better because you burn your enemies from high in the air." I thought of that when the New York Times published a photograph on its front page, at the top of its front page, New York Times, November 17th, 2003, was a photo of a gunner aiming a machine gun out of the back of a Black Hawk helicopter over Baghdad. And underneath the photo on the front page, in the reportorial voice attributed to no one, was a statement that alluded to the fact that these aircraft were having more and more trouble flying over Baghdad without being shot down. And here was the quote from the New York Times reporter, quote, "In 2 weeks, the Black Hawks and Chinooks and Apaches that once zoomed overhead with such grace and panache have suddenly become vulnerable," unquote. Well, we understand what that involves. We understand that when a news media can describe machines of mass killing as functioning with grace and panache, then we know what we're dealing with in terms of the media manifestations of the warfare state. I often think of something that Martin Luther King said. He put it this way: we need to confront the arrogance of feeling that we have everything to teach and nothing to learn from the rest of the world. And we have so much to learn, and so much that the United States has been teaching is so reprehensible that obviously we have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.